Welcome to All About Coffee, a page-by-page podcast. We're exploring William Harrison Euchre's century-old coffee encyclopedia, All About Coffee. One page, one paragraph, one sentence, one rabbit hole at a time, whatever it takes to work our way through over 800 pages of what was arguably the most important coffee book of the 20th century. I'm your host, Chief Annotationist, Director of Digressions, and Vice President of Asides, Mike Ferguson. Welcome to a never-ending journey through every single page, you've been warned, of W. H. Euchre's All About Coffee. Episode 2 is the preface, but before we get into the preface, I want to do some corrections and completions for Episode 1, biography, background, and front matter. Something I anticipate will be necessary for almost every episode. Corrections because I'll get things wrong and won't find out until after posting the episode, and completions when new information comes to light.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm blathering about. I've got information, man. New has come to light.
Correction number 1. When I was listing alumni for Central High School, I inexplicably said Penn of the Magic Act Penn and Teller, when it was Teller, not Penn, who went to Central High School. I cannot explain this error, especially taking into account the fact that I was picturing Teller when I said Penn. Correction number 2. I had speculated that Mr. Euchre's might have moved into the Gramercy Park Hotel upon the death of his wife, Helen, in 1951. But I finally found Helen de Graaf Euchre's obituary, and like her husband would do 3 years later, she died at her home in the Gramercy Park Hotel. What's more, census records indicate that when Mr. Euchre died in 1954, he had been living in the Gramercy Park Hotel for over 20 years. Wow, I got that one wrong. As for additional information, it turns out the child support case I mentioned briefly in Episode 1 was part of a larger, complicated, messy, and surprisingly public custody battle over Mr. Euchre's daughter with his first wife, Gladys. Reading some of the very dramatically written newspaper articles, it seems understandable that Mr. Euchre would not tell his colleagues this story later in life. I also discovered when Mr. Euchre and his first wife were married. William and Gladys were married on January 17th, 1899. Their daughter Helen was born on June 24th, 1899. Moving on. I've also discovered since Episode 1 that while at Central High School, Mr. Euchre was quite the performer. There are several notices in Philadelphia papers about him singing or giving speeches at various school events. In 1887, he wrote lyrics for music written by a friend, David Wallace, and the song was published. It was called Nellie's Cottage Home. You can find it online, but it's made difficult by the fact that another song, apparently more popular, called Nellie's Cottage Home, was published in 1875. Mr. Euchre's committing so many pages in All About Coffee to coffee in the arts and literature makes even more sense now. One final note on research. Did you know that Euchre's is slang for ukulele players? I really, really hate that. Let's get to Episode 2, the preface. The 1922 preface, dated June 17, 1922, contains both background information and acknowledgments. In the 1935 edition, the acknowledgments are separated on their own page. The 1922 acknowledgments recognize and thank 17 institutions, including 1 association, 2 institutes, 4 societies, 5 libraries, and 6 museums from all over the world. Mr. Euchre names and thanks 80 people from all over the world, plus unnamed secretaries in the American Chambers of Commerce in London, Paris, and Berlin. His gratitude ranges from the very specific, like translations from Arabic or permission to reproduce photographs or use quotes, to the vague, like assistance rendered or nice cooperation or courtesies. Several people are thanked for revising or contributing content to specific chapters or making revisions in general. One particular acknowledgement appears to communicate a little extra gratitude. Quote, Alonzo H. de Graaf, London, for his invaluable aid and unflagging zeal in directing the London researches, unquote. Alonzo H. de Graaf, actually Alonzo H. de Graaf Jr., was Mr. Euchre's brother-in-law, who was in the importing-exporting business and lived in London for 14 years. He is not thanked in the 1935 edition because by that time he had returned to America and was working at the Tea and Coffee Trade Journal as business manager.
You never say thank you!
That's what the money is for!
As mentioned, outside of acknowledgments, the preface contains background or context information, prefatory material, as they say. It's only around 300 words, so I'm not going to read it. I'm going to let Betty B., volunteer reader at LibriVox Audiobooks, read it. And this is your reminder that you can listen to the entire text of All About Coffee, read by volunteers, at LibriVox.org or on YouTube. Take it away, Betty.
17 years ago, the author of this work made his first trip abroad to gather material for a book on coffee. Subsequently, he spent a year in travel among the coffee-producing countries. After the initial surveys, correspondents were appointed to make researches in the principal European libraries and museums, and this phase of the work continued until April 1922. Simultaneous researches were conducted in American libraries and historical museums up to the time of the return of the final proofs to the printer in June 1922. 10 years ago, the sorting and classification of the material was begun. The actual writing of the manuscript has extended over 4 years. Among the unique features of the book are the Coffee Thesaurus, the Coffee Chronology, containing 492 dates of historical importance, the complete reference table of the principal kinds of coffee grown in the world, and the Coffee Bibliography, containing 1,380 references. The most authoritative works on this subject have been Robinson's The Early History of Coffee Houses in England, published in London in 1893, and Jardin's Le Café, published in Paris in 1895. The author wishes to acknowledge his indebtedness to both for inspiration and guidance. Other works, Arabian, French, English, German, and Italian, dealing with particular phases of the subject, have been laid under contribution, and where this has been done, credit is given by footnote reference. In all cases where it has been possible to do so, however, statements of historical facts have been verified by independent research. Not a few items have required months of tracing to confirm or to disprove. There has been no serious American work on coffee since Hewitt's Coffee, its History, Cultivation, and Uses, published in 1872, and Thurber's Coffee from Plantation to Cup, published in 1881. Both of these are now out of print, as is also Walsh's Coffee, its History, Classification, and Description, published in 1893.
And that concludes our summary review of the preface. Now, let's dig in. Mr. Ukers writes that 17 years before finishing All About Coffee, he made his first trip abroad to begin gathering material. Can confirm. On a 1922 passport application, he indicates he had previously been out of the country from June to September 1905, traveling to England, where his mother was born, and France. And then he traveled around the world from June 1906 to May 1907, the year of visiting coffee-producing countries that he writes about. The question I have about this year of travel is who the heck was writing, editing, and publishing the magazine during this time, selling the ad space? Who was pinch hitting for Mr. Ukers? It's just nearly impossible for me to imagine him taking his hand off the wheel for 12 issues. This was 1906. He couldn't exactly do the job remotely. Whatever the case, it would have taken a massive amount of planning. But by 1906, he had been involved in the publishing scene in New York for at least 10 years, and we know he was a networking machine. So I suppose he could have found people he trusted to put out the magazine while he was gone. According to newspaper directories, Tea and Coffee Trade Journal was being published at this time. Note that his 1906 passport application for that year abroad indicates that he was traveling alone. There is no photo for his 1906 passport application. That requirement wouldn't be established until 1914. But there is a physical description, and it indicates Mr. Ukers had a mustache. For all of us who have spent an unhealthy amount of time searching for and looking at photographs of Mr. Ukers, I have to say it's hard to picture him with a mustache, but it would have been common enough for a 33-year-old man in 1906. It appears that Mr. Ukers did not travel outside the U.S. for the 15 years from May 1907 to June 1922. Instead, he writes, correspondents were appointed to conduct research on his behalf throughout Europe. I can't think of any reason to speculate about why he didn't travel, but let's do it anyway. Remember, Mr. Euchers had investors when he purchased Tea and Coffee Trade Journal, and they brought $25,000 to the table, the equivalent of $900,000 today. I can imagine it was agreed he would need to take his trip around the world to visit coffee-growing countries, and that the trip was paid for from the startup fund. But when he returned, I feel confident that he would want to buy out his investors as soon as possible, and that would mean no more trips, just putting his head down and working hard for several years. When you add to this the personal turmoil of a divorce, a messy custody battle, and then World War I, travel seems unlikely. By the time war came to an end in the fall of 1918, he was writing all about coffee. His April 1922 passport application states that he would finally be traveling again in May to Europe. But on a 1924 passport application, he indicates he traveled to Europe in June of 1922. That checks out since, as noted, the preface is dated June 17, 1922, and he writes that June is when the final proofs went to the printer. Could it be that he had planned to leave in May but had to postpone his trip because the page proofs were not ready yet? Or perhaps the proofreading took him longer than he anticipated. In any case, he returned from Europe in September 1922, just in time for publication of All About Coffee in October. Helen traveled with him, but she was not required to obtain her own passport. It just simply noted on Mr. Euchers' passport application that she would be traveling with him, and in fact they appear together in the passport photo, which was common in those days. Sometimes an entire family would appear together in a passport photo. He writes that he began the sorting and classification of material in 1912. I can't say exactly what this means, but I take it to simply mean getting organized and setting up what must have been several filing cabinets. The writing itself, he says, took 4 years. Assuming he means 4 years in a row, he would have started sometime in 1918, perhaps in the spring if we take him literally. I think it fair to say that what Mr. Euchers meant was the writing of new material took 4 years, because we can find writing in Tea and Coffee Trade Journal that would find its way into All About Coffee, but predates 1918. After telling us how long it took to research and write All About Coffee, Mr. Euchers toots his own horn a little by telling us about a few unique features, which include a coffee thesaurus, a coffee chronology, a list of coffee growing around the world, and a coffee bibliography. The 492 dates in the chronology would grow to 562 by the 1935 edition, and the bibliography would grow from 1,380 entries to 2,000. One thing he doesn't mention that I think he should have mentioned is the book contains over 600 photographs and illustrations, making it truly unique for its time. As someone who is interested in and/or obsessed with coffee history, the coffee chronology has been for me the most practical and valuable of these unique features over the years, followed closely by the bibliography, which, as the years go by, becomes increasingly valuable as a resource. Of less practical use but interesting as history is the coffee thesaurus, which we will look at in a few episodes. I will say now that of the approximately 50 synonyms, which I think are actually euphemisms or metaphors, phrases, terms, idioms, expressions, I've never seen or heard a single one of them used. Have you ever heard anyone refer to coffee as the delicious libation we pour on the altar of friendship? Yeah, I didn't think so. Finally, before acknowledging the long list of 17 institutions and 80 people who helped him with the book, Mr. Euchers singles out 5 books for a special mention in the preface. There are nearly 1,400 books listed in the bibliography and almost 400 footnotes at the end of the book, but apparently only 5 books merit a mention in the preface, and only 2 of the 5 are described as having provided inspiration and guidance to Mr. Euchers, for which he writes he is indebted. The first book is The Early History of Coffee Houses in England, published in London in 1893. Mr. Euchers might have felt indebted, but not indebted enough to mention the author of that book, Edward Forbes Robinson, in his preface. Of course, his name does appear in footnotes and in the bibliography. It seems odd that a book devoted just to the early history of coffee houses in England would be so valuable to Mr. Euchers, who wrote a book of such breadth, until you read the book's subtitle, quote, "with some account of the first use of coffee and a bibliography of the subject," unquote. Robinson's own preface is 6.5 pages long compared to just 2 pages for Mr. Euchre's, and Robinson only thanks 3 people and 1 institution, the Guildhall Museum in London, also one of the museums Mr. Euchre's acknowledges almost 50 years later. Robinson's book only contains 8 illustrations compared to over 600 in All About Coffee. Despite the title of the book, a third of the text covers coffee history in general. Mr. Euchre's doesn't skimp on the history of English coffee houses, but no doubt it was this general history, as well as the coffee house history, that earned a mention of Robinson's book in the preface. And remember in episode 1 when we talked about the All About Coffee icon, which appears at the end of each chapter and was modeled after an English coffeehouse penny or token? Well, Robinson devotes 9 pages in an appendix to describing these various tokens, including one issued by Andrew Vincent of the Coffee House on Friday Street. Not only that, remember I said Robinson's book only contained 8 illustrations? Well, one of them is a depiction of 8 different coffeehouse tokens, and sure enough, one of them is the Andrew Vincent token featuring our All About Coffee icon, the hand in a circle pouring coffee. When I opened a digital copy of Robinson's book online and searched the term Friday Street, 2 entries were found. I clicked on the first and found a written description of the token in the appendix, which was cool enough. When I clicked on the second entry and found a drawing of the Vincent coin, I became unreasonably giddy. It was embarrassing. Although it's the same image, close inspection reveals that the Robinson illustration is a much better drawing, and it seems evident that Mr. Euchre's had someone copy the Robinson image. Compared to the rendering in Robinson, the Euchre's version looks a little clumsy. The other book that Mr. Euchre cites as providing inspiration and guidance is Jardin's Le Café. Pardon my French. Published in Paris in 1895. While I found the book online, I have not found an English translation. I did scroll through the entire book, however, and it's apparent that Mr. Euchre's often used Jardin as a template, not only in terms of what information to include in his book, but even how to visually present various information. Mr. Euchre's copies precisely the layout Jardin uses for presenting detailed information about coffees from different countries. So cheers to Mr. Euchre's for giving Le Café a nod in his preface. Mr. Euchre's then goes on to mention that there were many other books in several other languages, and they are all given credit with footnotes when quoted or referenced. He adds that, quote, "In all cases where it has been possible to do so, statements of historical facts have been verified by independent research. Not a few items have required months of tracing to confirm or disprove," unquote. Then he mentions 3 more books, but it's not clear that he is citing them because he's indebted to them for inspiration and guidance, or indebted to them for any reason at all. He doesn't say anything like that. It's more like he's simply acknowledging that there have been other books in the U.S., while at the same time pointing out that they are out of print, so when it comes to something comprehensive, All About Coffee is the only book available right now. Betty B., can you read that section again, please?
There has been no serious American work on coffee since Hewitt's Coffee, Its History, Cultivation, and Uses, published in 1872, and Thurber's Coffee from Plantation to Cup, published in 1881. Both of these are now out of print, as is also Walsh's Coffee, Its History, Classification, and Description, published in 1893.
Thank you, Betty. Let's take them in order. Coffee, Its History, Cultivation, and Uses by Robert Hewitt is a relatively slim volume of just over 100 pages. Hewitt was a coffee broker in New York, so no surprise the back of the book concludes with 7 pages of statistics on prices, import volumes, and tariffs around the world. The tone of the book is less academic, no bibliography, no index, no footnotes. Although Hewitt writes that the best authorities have been consulted in the preparation of the book, he doesn't thank any of them in the preface. However, he does name people throughout the book when he quotes them. We also find this somewhat remarkable sentence in the preface. Quote, "If occasion for enthusiasm is found in discussing the merits of roasted pig, surely very much stronger is the argument on behalf of roasted coffee." Unquote. Hewitt's chapters include the preface, an introduction, a history of the coffee plant, and then cultivation in various countries, which is organized into just 3 growing regions: Arabia, East Indies, and South America. There is a chapter on methods for making coffee, and one on analysis of adulteration in coffee, and then 2 chapters totaling 7 pages of statistics. My favorite part of the book might be the dedication page with its extravagantly ornate typefaces. To Benjamin G. Arnold, whose mercantile ability and honorable dealing entitle him to first rank and position in the coffee trade, this work is respectfully inscribed. B.G. Arnold was known as the King of Coffee back then in New York. We will meet him one day in the pages of All About Coffee. Arnold would have undoubtedly been a customer of Robert Hewitt's in his job as a coffee broker at Hewitt and Fife. Indeed, Hewitt's partner, James Fife, had worked for Arnold before he partnered with Hewitt. When Hewitt wrote his book, Arnold was in the early days of attempting to corner the coffee market. He and his partners would eventually succeed, and coffee prices would go way up. In 1 year, he made the 2024 equivalent of $30 million. But we all know what happens when prices go up dramatically. Producers plant more coffee. Eventually, supply would outpace demand, and Arnold's corner collapsed, and he lost his shirt. A year after the corner collapse, BG helped establish and then became the first president of the New York Coffee Exchange, created to discourage people from attempting what he had just recently attempted. I don't know if there is irony, regret, or penance in this part of the story, but according to Mr. Euchers, BG never lost his reputation as a straight shooter, even among those who disagreed with his attempt to corner the market. The fourth of 5 books Mr. Euchers mentions in his preface is Coffee from Plantation to Cup by Francis B. Thurber, published in 1881. I was able to obtain a copy of this book for the Specialty Coffee Association of America Library over 20 years ago, and as I opened it and made my way through the front matter, I came to the very charming dedication page. I won't read the whole thing, but it ends with, "I know of no person so well entitled to the honor of this dedication, and so this work is admiringly and respectfully inscribed to the man at Poughkeepsie, one of the chosen few who know how to make a good cup of coffee." Thurber is around half the length of All About Coffee. Like Hewitt, Thurber was also a coffee dealer, H.K. and F.B. Thurber and Company. Mr. Euchers quotes him at least twice in All About Coffee, but I'm not sure why Thurber doesn't rise to the level of inspirational or at least guidance. And now for a callback. Thurber devotes an entire chapter to the aforementioned King of Coffee, B.G. Arnold. While Hewitt was writing at the very beginning of Arnold's efforts to corner the coffee market, Thurber would have been writing as the market was collapsing and Arnold and several other firms were closing down. In the last 6 months of 1880, the coffee industry in New York and Boston combined lost approximately $200 million, adjusting for inflation. Although Mr. Euchers does not use any verbiage verbatim from Thurber's chapter on B.G. Arnold, it's clear that he used the chapter as a source. The last book Mr. Euchers mentions in his preface is Walsh's Coffee, Its History, Classification, and Description, published in 1893. Once again, like Hewitt 20 years before, like Thurber 10 years before, Walsh was a coffee broker. Also like Hewitt and Thurber, Walsh doesn't have a lot of academic touches, no bibliography, no footnotes, but there is a heavy dose of statistics around price and import volumes. The last page of the book is literally an advertisement for Joseph M. Walsh, importers of coffee. And maybe this is a clue as to why Mr. Euchers mentions Walsh, Thurber, and Hewitt as having existed in his preface, but doesn't really acknowledge them in any way as influences. We saw last episode how important it was to Mr. Euchers that everyone understood that his magazine, Tea and Coffee Trade Journal, was an independent publication and not what was known as a house organ, meaning an employee or customer newsletter. When he purchased Tea and Coffee Trade Journal, it was a house organ. When a newspaper industry publication, The Fourth Estate, reported that the Tea and Coffee Trade Journal would continue to be a house organ, Mr. Euchers wrote a letter to the editor pointing out that this was a mistake. His magazine would be an independent trade magazine, which is how we can maybe get away with saying he was sort of the founder. He didn't start the magazine named Tea and Coffee Trade Journal, but he did start the independent trade journal named Tea and Coffee Trade Journal. Hewitt, Thurber, and Walsh were all coffee traders. Do you not think they were giving away copies of their book to customers and potential customers? Of course they were. My guess, and it's nothing more than a guess, is that Mr. Euchers could not get past the fact that those books, as good as the content might have been, were also serving as promotional items. He couldn't bring himself to say he was inspired by merch. So the books are information, but not inspiration. He's obligated to recognize them, but not acknowledge them as influence, even though it's clear they served as resources. Even when he quotes Thurber in All About Coffee, it's not a flattering citation in the context of 1922. Quote, an authority of that day, Francis B. Thurber, in his book, Coffee from Plantation to Cup, which he dedicated to the railroad restaurant man at Poughkeepsie because he served an ideal cup of coffee, came out strongly for the good old boiling method with eggs, shells included. I might be reading into it, but I think Mr. Euchers is laughing into his hat here when he notes that Thurber dedicated his book to a railroad restaurant man because he served an ideal cup of coffee. Ideal cup of coffee is in quotes. The dedication that I found so charming, Mr. Euchers would be air quoting. I'll have more to say when we actually read that quote in the text, in the next life maybe. That quote is on page 712 in the 1922 edition. Let's do the math. The preface is 2 pages, and it took me 6 weeks to put this episode together. Let's say I get faster. Let's be super optimistic and say I'll eventually get to the point where I can put out 2 episodes a month. Some sections of the book will be faster, some slower, but on average, 20 episodes a year, each episode covering 2 pages. Let's round up and say we can get through 50 pages a year. There are approximately 725 pages of heavy text, and then around another 75 pages of bibliography, footnotes, index, and chronology, which I'm going to say we can do double time so we get through the last 100 pages in a year, leaving 700 pages at 50 pages a year, which maths out to finishing this podcast in 15 years. Let's not count 2024 because that's me finding my footing. And assuming all this fiction I'm writing right now has any validity, we finish in 2040. I like that date because, given the layout of the book, with over 600 illustrations, some information that's not deep diveable, that should allow for breaks. So we might reach the Thurber quote in 2039. The rest of the preface is acknowledgments, which we've sort of covered as much as we're going to cover, but I'll tell you what. If you want to hear Betty B. read the 80 names and 17 institutions, I'll include it at the very end of the show with a warning to stop listening if you don't want to hear the list. I mean, it's like 7.5 minutes. I leave you now, as I'll do each episode, with a scrap of coffee poetry from Chapter 32 of All About Coffee, the chapter on coffee and literature. This time we are quoting again from Lines on Coffee, written, we are told, by a French poet of the 18th century. Lines 1 through 4. Good coffee is more than a savory cup. Its aroma has power to dry liquor up. By coffee you get, upon leaving the table, a mind full of wisdom, thoughts lucid, nerves stable. You've been listening to All About Coffee, a page-by-page podcast written, read, and produced by me, Mike Ferguson. Thoughts mostly lucid, nerves somewhat stable. All About Coffee, a page-by-page podcast, is an independent podcast brought to you by Kavoya Specialty Coffee and presented by the Exchange Coffee Podcasting Network in beautiful downtown Providence, Rhode Island, atop the historic Tilden Thurber Building, home to the Exchange, Another Cup, Extra Shot, and Ristretto podcasts. Visit and explore at KavoyaCoffee.com, where coffee is always a collaborative voyage. Our music is My Buddy by Henry Burr and Homesick by Irving Berlin, both songs originally recorded in 1922 because of course they were. You can email me at allaboutcoffeepagebypage@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and please stop listening now if you do not want to hear Betty B. from LibriVox read acknowledgments for 80 people and 17 institutions from the 1922 preface. Betty?
The chapters on the chemistry of coffee and the pharmacology of coffee have been prepared under the author's direction by Charles W. Trigg, Industrial Fellow of the Mellon Institute of Industrial Research. The author wishes to acknowledge, with thanks, valuable assistance and numerous courtesies by the officials of the following institutions: British Museum and Guildhall Museum, London; Bibliothèque Nationale, Paris; Congressional Library, Washington; New York Public Library; Metropolitan Museum of Art and New York Historical Society, New York; Boston Public Library; and Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Smithsonian Institution, Washington; State Historical Museum, Madison, Wisconsin; Maine Historical Society, Portland; Chicago Historical Society, New Jersey Historical Society, Newark, Harvard University Library, Essex Institute, Salem, Massachusetts, Peabody Institute, Baltimore. Thanks and appreciation are due also to Charles James Jackson, London, for permission to quote from his Illustrated History of English Plate. Francis Hill Bigelow, author, and the Macmillan Company, publishers, for permission to reproduce illustrations from Historic Silver of the Colonies. H.G. Dwight, author, and Charles Scribner's Sons, publishers, for permission to quote from Constantinople, Old and New, and from the article on Turkish coffee houses in Scribner's Magazine. Walter G. Peter, Washington, D.C., for permission to photograph and reproduce pictures of articles in the Peter Collection at the United States National Museum. Mary P. Hamlin and George Arliss, authors, and George C. Tyler, producer, for permission to reproduce the Exchange Coffee House setting of the first act of Hamilton. Judge A.T. Clearwater, Kingston, New York, R.T. Haynes Halsey, and Francis P. Garvin, New York, for permission to publish pictures of historic silver coffee pots in their several collections. The Secretaries of the American Chambers of Commerce in London, Paris, and Berlin. Charles Cooper, London, for his splendid cooperation and for his special contribution to Chapter 35. Alonzo H. de Graaf, London, for his invaluable aid and unflagging zeal in directing the London researches. To the Coffee Trade Association, London, for assistance rendered. To G. J. Letham, London, for his translations from the Arabic. Geoffrey Sefton, Vienna, for his nice cooperation. L. P. Debussy of the Colonial Institute, Amsterdam, Holland, for assistance rendered. Burton Holmes and Blendon R. Campbell of New York, for courtesies. John Cotton Dana, Newark, New Jersey, for assistance rendered. Charles H. Barnes, Medford, Massachusetts, for permission to publish the photograph of Peregrine White's Mayflower Mortar and Pestle. Andrew L. Winton, Ph.D., Wilton, Connecticut, for permission to quote from his The Microscopy of Vegetable Foods in the chapter on the microscopy of coffee, and to reprint Professor J. Moeller's and T-shirts and Osterle's drawings. F. Hulton Frankel, Ph.D., Edward M. Frankel, Ph.D., and Arno V. Hoever, for their assistance in preparing the chapters on the botany of coffee and the microscopy of coffee. A. L. Burns, New York, for his assistance in the correction and revision of chapters 25, 26, 27, and 34, and for much historical information supplied in connection with chapters 30 and 31. Edward Aborn, New York, for his help in the revision of chapter 36. George W. Lawrence, former president, and T.S.B. Nielsen, president of the New York Coffee and Sugar Exchange, for their assistance in the revision of chapter 31. Helio Lobo, Brazilian Consul General, New York, Sebastião Sampaio, Commercial Attaché of the Brazilian Embassy, Washington, and T.H. Langard de Menezes, American representative of the Sociedade Promotora de Defensa do Café. Felix Costa, Secretary and Manager, the National Coffee Roasters Association, and C.B. Stroud, Superintendent, the New York Coffee and Sugar Exchange, for information supplied and assistance rendered in the revision of several chapters. F.T. Holmes, New York, for his help in the compilation of chronological and descriptive data on coffee roasting machinery. Walter Chester, New York, for critical comments on Chapter 28. The author is especially indebted to the following, who in many ways have contributed to the successful compilation of the complete reference table in Chapter 24, and of those chapters having to do with the early history and development of the green coffee and the wholesale coffee roasting trades in the United States. George S. Wright, Boston. A. E. Forbes, William Fisher, Gwyn Evans, Jerome J. Schotten, and the late Julius J. Schotten, St. Louis. James H. Taylor, William Bain, Jr., A. J. Dannemiller, B. A. Liverato, S. A. Schonbrun, Herbert Wild, A. C. Fitzpatrick, Charles Meehan, Clarence Creighton, Abram Wakeman, A. H. Davies, Joshua Walker, Fred P. Gordon, Alex H. Purcell, George W. Vanderhoof, Colonel William P. Room, W. Lee Simmons, Herman Simmons, W. H. Aborn, B. Leahy, John C. Loudon, J. R. Westphal, Abraham Reamer, R. C. Wilhelm, C. H. Stewart, and the late August Haisler, New York. John D. Warfield, Ezra J. Warner, S. O. Blair, and George D. McLaughlin, Chicago. W. H. Harrison, James Heekin, and Charles Lewis, Cincinnati. Albro Blodgett and A. M. Wolson, Toledo. R. V. Engelhard and Lee G. Zinsmeister, Louisville. E. A. Call, San Francisco. S. Jackson, New Orleans. Louis Sherman, Milwaukee. Howard F. Boardman, Hartford. A. H. Devers, Portland, Oregon. W. James Mayhood, Pittsburgh. William B. Harris, East Orange, New Jersey. New York, June 17, 1922.